Good morning, friends, and welcome to Wake Up in the Word. Hey, thanks for joining me today. Listen, I've got the Snoopy and Woodstock cup today because life seems like a cartoon almost every day. Are you wondering what's going to pop up next? It's weird in the world today, but hey, guess what? Jesus is coming and he'll straighten all that out. So let's get back to the life of Christ as we look at what he's sharing with us today in two very important analogies that you and I need to pick up, and one that is often misunderstood. Now, we find first in Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, this story that is repeated in chapter 9 of Matthew's Gospel, but we're going to end up in Luke's because of a couple of details he adds that are not found in these two accounts. Now, what does it say? Well, remember, we're right there on the heels of this party that the new disciple Matthew has thrown for Jesus to introduce all of his friends who are a bunch of sinners. They're just a pack of ordinary people, and among them tax collectors and prostitutes, all kinds of folks, and he's introducing them to the Messiah. Oh, my goodness, isn't that just terrible? Say the Pharisees and the scribes. They're like, these are not the right kind of people for you to be hanging out with. And yet Jesus says, I've come to seek sinners. I'm the physician that they need. Those who are sick need the doctor, not those who at least think they are well. So on the heels of this, we've got this question coming up that we'll address first in Mark 2, verse 18, where it says, Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Well, that was a regular part of Jewish life, wasn't it? To fast at different times. Well, it says in the next sentence that people came and asked him, why did John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples fast, but your disciples do not fast? Well, Jesus said to them, this is verse 19, the wedding guests cannot fast while the groom is with them, can they? Why, as long as they have the groom with them, they cannot fast. But the time will come when the groom will be taken away from them, and they will fast on that day. Yeah, there's a party going on right now because the groom is here. And so you need to celebrate while he's with you. The day's coming when he will be gone. Well, the next addition to this is quite interesting and in some minds confusing unless you go back to rabbinic tradition. Now, hang on. Jesus moves from this statement about fasting to a new statement in verse 21. He says, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new patch pulls away from the old cloth and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins and the wine is lost as well as the skins. No, new wine is put into fresh wineskins. Well, all that makes absolute sense, doesn't it, when you know about the fermentation process? But when we get over to Luke's gospel, we've got something additional added here, because if you think of that right off the top of your head from a Western tradition, you're going to get the idea that Jesus is talking about the new covenant versus the old covenant, something of that nature. And that's not what he's talking about. So hang on, hold your horses. Let's look at Luke's version and get the full picture. Down in chapter 5, verse 34, Jesus again, in answer to that question about these disciples not fasting, says, look, you can't make the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? But the time will come when the groom will be taken away from them. Then they will fast in those days. The subject here, as it was in previous verses, is the disciples of Jesus Christ. These characters that you're calling to follow you. Why aren't you getting the ones from the rabbinic schools, the ones that are the sharp new young minds that have been fully trained in the law, in our version of it at least? So this is the background. Now, Luke is the only one of the gospel writers that uses this phrase in verse 36. He also told them a parable, referring to what he's about to share, this story, as a parable. Some would call it an analogy, a story, but a parable basically is some kind of story that's laid out to give us a spiritual truth. So here's what Jesus says next. No one tears a patch from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Otherwise, not only will he tear the new, but also the piece from the new garment will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins, it will spill, and the skins will be ruined. No new wine is put into fresh wineskins. And here's a verse that you didn't see in the other two. Hang on. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants new, because he says the old is better. Now, we can't be talking about the old covenant versus the new covenant, because Jesus here says the old is better. It would be saying, the new teaching isn't the best thing. No, it's the old. The old is better. So that's obviously not what he's talking about. To fully understand this, I think you just simply need to look at the context in which it was being spoken for the day. Now, the Bible Made Plain folks do a real good job of explaining this. You see, Jesus wasn't addressing law versus grace, nor was he addressing old teachings versus new teachings, because firstly, this is not the context. And this statement in verse 39 would make no sense whatsoever. Jesus was addressing a particular group of people. Who is that? The scribes and the Pharisees. Now, they had questioned his choice of disciples. They were saying, what are you doing picking up the tax collector, fisherman, all these strange people to follow you? And now he chooses it by explaining, he chooses to explain all of this by choosing to give them this, what Luke calls a parable. The other two don't mention it as that, but a story to make it plain to them. And he must have made it plain because there was no further questioning after that. It's like everybody said, oh, okay, I got it. So watch this. There's a well-known proverb that's found in some of the rabbinical writings. These have been traced all the way back, at least in print, to the first century, but they were oral traditions that went back long before that, so they were obviously being used in Jesus' day. And when it comes to this particular rabbinic tradition, you can find out exactly what it means by quoting one of the rabbis. It says that Rabbi Meir said, "Don't look at the container, but at that which is in it. There is a new container full of old wine, and an old container in which there's not even new wine." Well, in this proverb, the vessels containing the wine are the individuals. Now, wow, that kind of matches up with Scripture, doesn't it? Both New and Old Testament, if you know what I'm referring to, of course. He says the wine is something that's being given to the individuals represented by the container. So the wine is the teaching that the individual consumes or contains. So applying this symbolism to the parable of the wineskins, we get the following. The symbol of the old wineskin and the garment is referring to the old students that had the formal rabbinic education. The new wine and the new garment is referring to the new students who had no formal rabbinic education. The old wine or the patch would be the old teaching. The new wine or new patch would be the new teaching. So substituting those symbols with the meaning, we get to transform the parable into plain English, which would mean what? No one teaches a new teaching of the law to students educated in the traditions of the Pharisees, or else the new teaching will be rejected and the student will be lost. But the new teaching of the law must be taught to new students, and both are preserved. And no one educated in the traditions of the Pharisees wants the new, for he says that the old teaching is better. So this meaning of the parable is now clear. The new teaching must be given to these new students in order to be received. And that helps us to explain verse 39, where it says, "No one having drunk old wine immediately desires the new, for he says, the old is better." Well, those educated in the traditions of the Pharisees were quite biased toward them. Rejecting the new teaching, they always say the old is better. So the scribes and Pharisees couldn't really understand Jesus' choice of disciples. They lacked the formal education that these people thought was absolutely necessary if you're going to fit into the Jewish religious tradition of the day. This was evident even when you get over into the book of Acts, where in Acts chapter 4 they drag Peter and John before the Sanhedrin. And what does it say about them? It says, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, this is Acts 4:13, they perceived that they were uneducated and untrained men, and they marveled. Yeah. Of course, at Matthew's banquet, the scribes and the Pharisees criticized the behavior of Jesus' disciples and his choice of them. So Jesus responded with this story, with this parable, which is in essence explaining to them why they were not qualified for the role of disciple. Yet these lowlifes that he has picked to follow him most exceptionally are. Well, that's a good lesson for today. You think you're able to handle the teachings of Jesus? Hey, these disciples were ordinary guys and gals that followed Jesus, just like you can follow him even today. God bless you. I'll see you right here tomorrow when we wake up in his word.